The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, silencing the usual afternoon chatter as Ethan Everett crouched behind an overturned wagon, blood seeping through his fingers where he clutched his side. He wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to be bleeding out in some godforsaken town in Wyoming Territory in the year 1875. But then again, Ethan had never been one for following the expected path. "Drop your weapon, Everett," Sheriff Milton's voice boomed across the town square. "Those women are property of the Blackwater Mining Company, and you're interfering with official business." Ethan gritted his teeth against the pain. Property. The word made his stomach turn. For women, chained together in the back of a prison wagon, labeled as wild and unmanageable, headed for a life of servitude in the company's laundry after allegedly causing trouble at their previous posts. He'd spotted them while riding into town, saw the desperation in their eyes, and something inside him had snapped. "They ain't property," Ethan shouted back. "They're human beings." He risked a glance at the women, huddled together near the saloon where he'd managed to get them before the shooting started. For pairs of eyes stared back at him frightened, yet with a flicker of hope he hadn't seen before. The standoff lasted another 20 minutes before Ethan managed to negotiate a solution, emptying his savings to purchase the women's contracts. As the sheriff and mining company men rode away, Ethan stood in the dusty street, wondering what in tarnation he'd just gotten himself into. "You're bleeding," said a soft voice beside him. The tallest of the women had approached, her dark hair escaping from a practical bun. Unlike the others, she didn't seem afraid, just determined. "It's nothing," Ethan muttered, though his vision was starting to blur. "I'm Delilah Wells," she said, carefully pulling his hand away to examine the wound. "I was a nurse during the war. Let me help you before you fall over dead in the street." That was how it began, with blood and dust and desperation. Ethan Everett, 32 years old, former cavalry scout, now rancher with a modest spread outside of town, suddenly responsible for 4 women's society, had deemed too troublesome to handle. By nightfall, Ethan found himself seated at his kitchen table while Delilah stitched his wound. The other women, Mary Baker, Catherine Peterson, and Rebecca Johnson, watched nervously from various corners of his modest cabin. "So what exactly did you 4 do to earn yourselves a one-way ticket to a mining camp?" Ethan asked through gritted teeth as Delilah's needle pierced his skin again. Mary, the youngest at perhaps 19, looked down at her hands. "I refused the advances of my employer's son." Catherine, a redhead with freckles scattered across her nose, added, "I taught some of the miners' children to read, including the colored ones. The mine owner didn't appreciate that." Rebecca, who carried herself with quiet dignity despite her tattered dress, said simply, "I spoke up when I saw injustice. Apparently, women aren't supposed to have opinions about working conditions." Ethan's eyes shifted to Delilah, who was focused on her stitching. "And you, Miss Wells?" She tied off the thread and cut it with a small pair of scissors from her pocket. "I treated everyone who needed medical attention, regardless of whether they could pay or what color their skin was. Some folks in Sweetwater didn't care for that approach." Ethan studied her face, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her hazel eyes. "So none of you are actually wild at all?" "Depends on your definition," Delilah replied, a hint of challenge in her voice. "We're not the docile, obedient women some men think we should be. I suppose that makes us wild in certain company." That night, Ethan gave up his bed for the women to share and slept on a bedroll by the fire. As he drifted off, he wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into. His brother would laugh himself silly if he could see this Ethan Everett, known for keeping to himself since returning from the war, suddenly housing for women branded as troublemakers. The next morning brought reality crashing down. 5 people in a one-room cabin meant no privacy and too many bodies. Plus, Ethan had a ranch to run, cattle to tend, and no plan for what to do with 4 women who had nowhere else to go. "I can cook," Mary offered when Ethan mentioned the problem over a breakfast of barely edible flapjacks he'd prepared one-handed. "I know how to garden," Catherine added. "And I'm good with animals." Rebecca straightened her shoulders. "I kept books for my father's store before he passed. I can help with your accounts." Delilah said nothing, just watched Ethan with those perceptive eyes that seemed to look right through him. "You don't have to earn your keep," Ethan said gruffly. "I just need to figure out where to take you that's safe." "And where would that be?" Delilah finally spoke. "The nearest town where women like us would be welcome is hundreds of miles away. We have no money, no family waiting for us." Ethan ran a hand through his dark hair, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "There's an old line shack about half a mile from here. It's not much, but it would give you all some space. I could fix it up." The arrangement was meant to be temporary. Ethan helped the women settle into the line shack, bringing supplies from town and materials to patch the roof. The women set to work making the small structure livable, and within days, they'd created a tidy if cramped home. To Ethan's surprise, they also made themselves useful around his ranch. Mary's cooking was a vast improvement over his own, and she began preparing meals for everyone. Catherine discovered Ethan's neglected vegetable garden and brought it back to life, while also developing a remarkable rapport with his horses. Rebecca, true to her word, organized his chaotic financial records, revealing that he was better off than he'd realized. And Delilah. She checked his wound daily, changing the bandage with gentle hands that belied her fierce spirit. She asked questions about his life that no one had bothered to ask in years, drawing out stories he'd almost forgotten how to tell. "You were a scout?" she asked one evening as they sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of orange and purple. "For the Union Army. I know the territories better than most. Grew up traveling with my father, who was a trapper." "And after the war?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'd seen enough. Bought this land with my service pay. Figured I'd be better off with just my horses and cattle for company." Delilah studied him, her head tilted slightly. "Yet here you are, harboring for fugitive women." "You're not fugitives. In the eyes of the Blackwater Mining Company, we are. You put yourself at risk for us." "Why?" Ethan didn't have a good answer. He'd acted on instinct, on the same gut feeling that had kept him alive during the war. "No one deserves to be treated like property," was all he said. As weeks passed, a routine developed. The women worked alongside Ethan during the day, and in the evenings, they would gather at his cabin or the line shack to share meals and conversation. Ethan found himself talking more than he had in years, drawn out of his shell by their questions and laughter. He noticed, too, how different each woman was, despite their shared label as too wild. Mary was sweet but determined, with a core of steel beneath her gentle demeanor. Catherine was passionate about education, often reading aloud from Ethan's small collection of books. Rebecca was pragmatic and intelligent, with a dry wit that surprised him. And Delilah, she was like no one he'd ever met, confident in her abilities, unafraid to speak her mind, yet compassionate in a way that made even Ethan's most weathered ranch hands respect her. When one of his men sliced open his arm on barbed wire, she stitched him up without flinching. When another came down with fever, she stayed by his side through the night. It was Rebecca who first noticed the change in Ethan. "You smile more," she observed one day as they checked his ledgers. "It suits you." Ethan grunted non-committally, but he knew she was right. The heaviness he'd carried since the war had lightened somehow. He found himself looking forward to evenings, to the sound of women's laughter filling his home. And if his eyes lingered longer on Delilah than the others, well, that was something he kept to himself. The first hint of trouble came 2 months after the women's arrival. Ethan rode into town for supplies and found Sheriff Milton waiting for him outside the general store. "Blackwater's offering a reward for those women," Milton said without preamble. $300, alive and unharmed. Ethan's hand instinctively moved toward his revolver. "They paid me fair and square for their contracts." "That may be, but they're claiming the women stole from the company before they were apprehended. I don't believe it myself, but some folks might be tempted by that kind of money." "Thanks for the warning," Ethan said stiffly, loading his supplies into his saddlebags. "Everett," Milton called as Ethan mounted his horse. "Word of advice. Those women should leave the territory. And soon." Ethan rode back to the ranch with a knot in his stomach. The thought of the women leaving shouldn't bother him as much as it did. Wasn't that the plan all along? To help them get back on their feet and send them somewhere safe? But as he approached the ranch and saw smoke rising from his chimney, heard the sound of Catherine singing as she tended the garden, watched Mary hanging laundry while Rebecca mended a fence alongside two of his ranch hands, felt like home in a way it never had before. And then there was Delilah, who emerged from the barn leading his favorite mare, deep in conversation with the animal as if they shared a secret language. She looked up as he approached, her face breaking into a smile that hit him like a physical force. That night, after the others had retired to the line shack, Delilah lingered at Ethan's cabin. She'd been helping him treat a calf with a respiratory ailment, and they sat by the fire, discussing the animal's progress. "Blackwater's put a bounty on you all," Ethan said abruptly. $300. Delilah's hands stilled on the cup of coffee she held. "I see. You should all leave. Head east, maybe. I can give you enough money to start fresh somewhere." She set down her cup carefully. "Is that what you want, Ethan? For us to leave?" Her directness caught him off guard. "What I want doesn't matter. What matters is keeping you safe." "It matters to me," she said quietly. "What you want." The fire crackled in the silence between them. Ethan stared into the flames, unwilling to meet her eyes, afraid of what she might see there. "I want," he began, then stopped. "I've gotten used to having you all around. The ranch is running better than it ever has." "Is that all?" Ethan finally looked at her, at the challenge in her eyes. "No," he admitted. "That's not all." Before either could say more, a gunshot shattered the night. Ethan was on his feet instantly, reaching for his rifle above the door. Delilah was right behind him as he rushed outside to see flames licking at the roof of the line shack. "Mary! Catherine! Rebecca!" Delilah screamed, already running toward the burning building. Ethan overtook her, reaching the shack first. The door had been barricaded from the outside, a deliberate act to trap the women inside. He tore away the boards as smoke billowed around him. Behind him, he heard Delilah shouting for water, heard his ranch hands emerging from the bunkhouse. The next minutes were chaos, pulling the three coughing, terrified women from the burning shack, forming a bucket line to battle the flames, scanning the darkness for whoever had done this. By the time the fire was under control, the line shack was half destroyed, and Ethan's fury was a living thing inside him. "Blackwater?" Delilah asked as they huddled in his cabin, the other women wrapped in blankets, soot-streaked and shaken. "Bounty hunters, more likely," Ethan said, "trying to smoke you out for an easy capture." "They could have killed us," Catherine whispered, trembling. Ethan's jaw clenched. "I won't let that happen." That night, the women stayed in his cabin, crowded together on his bed and the floor. Ethan sat by the window with his rifle, watching the darkness. Delilah joined him around midnight, settling onto the floor beside his chair. "We should leave," she said softly, so as not to wake the others. "This is your home, your life. We've brought danger to your door." "No." The word came out harsher than he intended. "Ethan, "This is your home too," he said, his voice low and intense. "All of you, if you want it to be." In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, he saw surprise flicker across her face. "You mean that?" "I do." He hesitated, then added, "Especially for you, Delilah." Her hand found his in the darkness, warm and steady. "Then we stay and fight." And fight they did. The next morning, Ethan rode into town with Rebecca, who had the best head for business. They visited the bank, the land office, and finally the telegraph office, sending messages to contacts Ethan had from his scouting days. By the time they returned, Delilah had organized the defense of the ranch. Catherine and Mary were busy preparing food that could be eaten cold if necessary, while the ranch hands reinforced doors and windows under Delilah's direction. "You've turned my peaceful cattle ranch into a fortress," Ethan observed, not entirely displeased. Delilah brushed a strand of hair from her face, leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "If they come back, they'll find we're not easy targets." That night, they gathered around Ethan's table to hear the plan he and Rebecca had devised. "I've filed legal paperwork making all 4 of you employees of the Everett Ranch," he explained, "with contracts and everything proper. Rebecca's signature is witness to the fact that you're working for fair wages." "How does that help?" Catherine asked. Rebecca smiled. "Because employees can't be claimed as property, and there's no outstanding warrant for any actual crime. The mining company was counting on the fact that women have few legal protections. But employed women with a male advocate have more standing. And," Ethan added, "I've sent telegrams to some fellows I know from the war who now work for newspapers in Denver and San Francisco. They're very interested in a story about a mining company illegally holding women as indentured servants." Mary's eyes widened. "You're going to shame them publicly?" "Nothing hurts a company like Blackwater more than bad publicity," Rebecca confirmed. "Investors get nervous. Customers ask questions." Delilah studied Ethan thoughtfully. "This is quite the scheme for a man who claims to prefer the company of cattle." Ethan felt his face warm under her scrutiny. "I picked up a few things during the war besides scouting, like how to fight battles you can't win with just guns." The attack came 3 nights later, not bounty hunters this time, but hired guns from Blackwater itself. 6 men, well armed and determined to retrieve the company property they'd been sent for. They hadn't counted on Ethan's experience or Delilah's strategic mind. The ranch hands were positioned strategically, the women armed and ready. When the shooting started, Ethan found himself back to back with Delilah, her steady presence calming his racing heart. "Just like field surgery," she muttered as bullets splintered wood around them. "Stay focused on what needs doing." The firefight lasted less than 15 minutes. 2 of the attackers were wounded, the others surrendered when they realized they were outmaneuvered. By dawn, Sheriff Milton had arrived to take them into custody, looking somewhat impressed despite himself. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Everett," he said as his deputies loaded the prisoners into a wagon. "Seems to me Blackwater did that all on their own," Ethan replied. "And I've got witnesses and documentation to prove it." Milton sighed. "Those telegrams you sent are already bearing fruit. Got a message from the territorial governor himself this morning. He's sending a marshal to investigate Blackwater's labor practices. It was the beginning of the end for Blackwater's power in the region." The newspaper stories sparked outrage, the investigation uncovered numerous abuses, and by winter, the mining company had new management and a very different approach to their workers. For the women of Everett Ranch, life settled into a new pattern. Mary began teaching at the newly established school in Redemption Creek, riding in each morning and returning in the evening. Catherine took charge of the ranch's horses, developing a small but profitable sideline in breeding and training. Rebecca managed the ranch's finances and started a correspondence with a lawyer in Cheyenne who seemed quite taken with her letters. And Delilah. She established a small infirmary on the ranch, treating not only Ethan's men but also townsfolk who found her skills and straightforward manner preferable to the often drunk town doctor. She planted an herb garden, ordered medical texts from back east, and gradually created a place where anyone regardless of means or background could receive care. Through it all, she and Ethan circled each other like planets in a shared orbit. Their friendship deepened, their mutual respect evident to anyone who saw them working together. But something unspoken remained between them, growing stronger with each passing day. It was Catherine who finally lost patience with them both. "For heaven's sake," she exclaimed one evening as she caught them staring at each other across the dinner table. "Would you two just admit you're in love and put us all out of our misery?" Ethan choked on his coffee while Delilah's cheeks flushed crimson. Mary giggled behind her hand, and Rebecca merely raised an eyebrow. "Catherine," Delilah admonished, though without much heat. "Well, it's true," Catherine insisted. "Everyone can see it. Even the horses have noticed, and they're not particularly observant creatures." Later that night, after the other women had returned to the new cabin Ethan had built to replace the line shack, Delilah remained behind to tend to a ranch hand with a sprained ankle. When she finally stepped onto the porch to leave, Ethan was waiting for her. "Did you mean what you said that night?" she asked without preamble. "That this could be our home if we wanted it to be?" Ethan nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "I did. And what about now? Do you still want us here?" "I want you here," he said, the words coming out rough with emotion. "The others too, of course, but it's you, Delilah. It's always been you." She took a step closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. "I was engaged once before the war," she said softly. "He didn't come home. I promised myself I wouldn't give my heart away again." Ethan felt a crushing weight descend on his chest. "But promises made in grief aren't always meant to be kept," she continued. "You taught me that, Ethan Everett. You, with your quiet strength and your unwavering conviction that people deserve to be free." "Delilah," he breathed, afraid to hope. "I love you," she said simply. "I've loved you since that day in Redemption Creek when you stood against a dozen men to save 4 women you didn't even know." Ethan closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to cradle her face. "You've brought life back to this ranch. To me." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long journey. They were married the following spring, with Mary, Catherine, and Rebecca standing as Delilah's witnesses. The ceremony took place on the ranch, under the big cottonwood tree where they'd often sat talking into the evening. "Never thought I'd see the day," Ethan's foreman muttered as they watched the bride approach in a simple white dress adorned with wildflowers. The most stubborn, solitary man in Wyoming, tamed at last. But Ethan didn't feel tamed. He felt completed. As Delilah took his hands and spoke her vows in that clear, confident voice of hers, he understood that what had happened between them wasn't about taming at all. It was about becoming more fully themselves together than they ever could have been apart. The ranch prospered in the years that followed. The other women eventually moved on. Mary married the town's young minister. Catherine established her own horse breeding operation with Ethan's backing, and Rebecca accepted a proposal from her lawyer correspondent after a courtship conducted largely through letters. But they remained family, gathering for holidays and celebrations, bringing children who grew up calling Ethan and Delilah uncle and aunt, even when no blood relation existed. Ethan and Delilah had 2 children of their own, a son who inherited his father's quiet strength and his mother's healing hands, and a daughter whose fierce intelligence and determination reminded everyone of both her parents. The story of how they met became something of a legend in Redemption Creek. How Ethan Everett, the solitary rancher, had rescued 4 women labeled too wild for society, only to find that one of them would rescue him right back. How a man who'd closed himself off after the horrors of war found his heart reopened by a woman brave enough to live by her principles. 10 years after their wedding, Ethan and Delilah sat on their porch watching the sunset, just as they had so many times before. Their children played in the yard, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. "Do you ever think about how different life might have been?" Delilah asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "If you hadn't been in town that day?" Ethan's arm tightened around her. "I try not to. Some things are meant to be, I reckon." She smiled up at him, the years having added only character to her beauty. "Like a stubborn cowboy and a woman too wild for most men to handle?" "Especially that," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I wasn't looking to be tamed, you know. And I wasn't looking to tame anyone," she replied. "Just to be free to be myself." "And that," Ethan said, watching as their children chased fireflies in the gathering dusk, "is exactly why I fell in love with you, Delilah Wells Everett. Not because you tamed me, but because you showed me how to be free." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the Wyoming wind whispered through the cottonwoods. On Everett Ranch, a family built on courage and conviction watched the stars emerge, secure in the knowledge that sometimes being too wild was exactly what was needed to find one's way home.